Okay, so today we're going to look at the second part of the Constitution. We've done the first part, we've done the fundamental principles and the rights and duties of the citizen. Now we're going to start on Article 55 in Part 2 of the Constitution, Ordinamento della Repubblica. So we're going to talk about the Republican system and how it works. So here we're analysing the state and the institutions of the state, like the parliament, the government, the magistrates, the president of the republic, what their functions are, what they do, and what are their limits to their powers. So it's all described in the second part. Before we do that, we're going to talk about the separation of powers. The power is separated into three parts in any democracy, and that runs all the way through the second part of the Constitution. Later on we'll look at where in the Constitution it's separated, this power. But first of all, what do we mean by power? Power is the power to change our reality. For example, do we want more electric cars on the road? Do we want more protection for consumers? Do we want TAV, no TAV? Do we want more redistribution of income, etc., etc.? And who decides this and who puts this into acts and who judges this is who's got the power. So that is done by the state, and here we're talking about the state in the second part. Now, where does this power come from? This power comes from, in a democracy, the people. We know that a democracy is the will of the people. The people have the power. And originally it comes from the people. It's transferred to the representatives of the people through a vote. When people vote for their representative, that representative will go to Parliament and exercise that power according to what they promised the people. So if I vote for somebody because he promises to do something, I lend him the power. In Italy, in Article 1 of your Constitution, it says, La sovranità appartiene al popolo. So this is very clear. The people have the power, but they lend it to their representatives based on the promises made by the representatives to be used in Parliament. So that's where it comes from. And the big danger of power, the reason it must be separated, is because we know power corrupts. If our representatives have all the power, are not controlled and limited, they will think, they're human beings, they will think of their interests, even when they don't think they're thinking of their interests. Deep down, their interests will come first. Maybe in the beginning, they're very idealistic, they have good intentions, but after years of feeling very special because they have the power, slowly, they will put their interests before the interests of others, and the institutions are the same. The institutions protect themselves in the long run. So we want this power separated in order that the different parts of the power can control each other, can check each other and put limits. The fusion of power is dangerous. So we split it. We split it in three ways. The power is things. Making the decision is one part of the power. Should we have TAV or no TAV, for example, that's a power to make that decision. That's the legislative power. And the legislative function is given to the Parliament. So this is the most important. Deciding, making that decision, really is the most important thing. But then you need to put it into action. So that's another part of the power, is putting the decisions into action, and that's called the executive power. The executive function is done by the government. The government has ministries, for example, the Ministry of Education. If the Parliament decides, no smoking in schools, the government's education ministry will put this into action. It will, make regulations to put notices on walls, etc., and inform, headmasters what their new role is, etc. It will enforce this decision, put this decision into action through its ministries. But then there's another part of the power, which is to judge whether the law is actually or has actually disciplined a behaviour, any particular behaviour, or has that behaviour violated this decision, this ruling, that you can't or must do whatever. And that's the judicial power. And the judicial function is done by judges, the magistratura. They're there to decide on each individual or even, organisation, social formation, they say in your constitution, whether that has violated or not the decision, the original decision, which is the law. And then to bring consequences for that if there has been a violation. So you've got these three different parts to the power, and each part, by splitting it into three different parts, they give each institution a different part. You've got the Parliament with the legislative power and the government with the executive power. That's separate. And then these institutions can check each other and make a balance. You've got these checks and balances. They balance each other by having the power, so the magistrates can point the finger. It does create tension between the institutions. The magistrates can point the finger at the politicians and say, no, you can't do that. The Constitutional Court may say that's against the Constitution, that's unconstitutional, you can't do that. Or the politicians may point at the magistrates and accuse them of being wrong. For example, the magistrates accuse Salvini of kidnapping immigrants by stopping the boats coming to Italy with immigrants. They weren't considered illegal because they claimed to be refugees. He stopped the boats. The magistrates said, you can't do that, it's kidnap. And he accused the magistrates of being left-wing or communist and being political. So there is some tension also between government and parliament. Often there's tension, and this is a good thing, because this means, if they're getting outside their limits, the other institutions will start pointing the finger and putting them back in their place. So these are the checks and balances we need by separating the power. The legislative power and executive power, which is held by the government and the parliament, are actually a little bit mixed. So they're not very clean separation. The parliament controls the government. It can have a vote of no confidence, fiducia, and make the government dissolve, collapse the government. So it does control the government a little bit. And the government also does some legislative roles. For example, it can make a decree if a law is urgent and needs immediate to be done immediately. It can do that as a decree, but ultimately the Parliament must approve of that within a certain time limit. So it still maintains that legislative function, but the government can do that for reasons of urgency. And also, and that was done a lot with COVID, because we had to react quickly with COVID, they used a lot of decrees. And alternatively, the Parliament can say to the government, you make a law, you write the details, these are the limits. You mustn't go outside these limits. So the government does have a legislative role there. But the judiciary is very independent. Okay, so there's no confusion there. Remember, the judges must be impartial. They cannot be political. They cannot have a philosophy. They must judge and interpret a law in a scientific way without prejudices, without thinking, is that going to harm the poor or the rich, or will it, be fair on immigrants, etc. They've just got to interpret the law and apply the law, regardless of what their personal position is politically. They've got to be very scientific. And so the judges have a particular strong separation from the other powers. In fact, that's written clearly in the Constitution. They act without fear or favour. It says in the Constitution they're very independent, they cannot be sacked or assumed by politicians, etc. So they can't be intimidated. They must carry out the laws, even if they're made by politicians of the past, leanings. Maybe they've got a right-wing government, but the law was made by a very left-wing government. They've got to enforce the law. It doesn't matter if it's right or left. So that's very important. That separation is particularly important. Now, what would happen if there is a fusion of power? We've seen that in the past. There was a fusion of power, for example, when there was a king, and the king would make the law. Maybe he can decide who was going to write the law and make it, and he could sack whoever, and everything in the end, everything was done for his interest, with his specific needs being taken into consideration, and the people didn't count at all. So, or it could be a group of people, like Nazi Germany. It was a group of people's interests that were important, and they could make the law, and if they didn't like someone, it doesn't matter if they respected the law, they would say, well, we interpret it like this, and you're going to prison anyway, etc. They could just bend the law to their will, and in the end it was all for their needs and their interests. So with a fusion of power, even if at the beginning people have great intentions and strong ideals, etc., in the end it will be for their needs. So this separation is very important to maintain those checks and balances, stop that power being used only for a very small group or one person, and it must be used for the collective needs and the collective interests, which are the Italian citizens. Remember, a parliamentarian, who is the representative of the people, must act in the nation's interest, must think of the nation's interest. He doesn't even think about his constituents' interest. He must think, own and act only for the nation. That's written in the Constitution too. He's not just a representative of his constituency, of those that voted for him, but of all the citizens, those that didn't vote for him, but also those outside his area of representation.